This is Michael Ingwe with the Passive House Accelerator, and thanks for tuning in to this special bonus episode of the Passive House podcast recorded at the International Passive House Conference 24 in Innsbruck, Austria. And a big thank you to Source 2050 for their support of the series. I am sitting with the one and only Lloyd Alter.
A pleasure to be here. We should also mention we're also right next to the airport. We have birds and airplanes and other distractions, and had to move a couple of times to find a place to record this, but that's fine. It's still beautiful Innsbruck. It's amazing.
So how's the conference been so far?
It's been interesting. I've been sort of terrified by it because I was at a conference in Denver in the last fall, and Jessica Grove-Smith was there. And I said to Jessica, can you got to give me a reason to come to Innsbruck. You know, I have to tell my wife I'm moderating a panel or I'm doing something, I'm not an architect anymore. I need an excuse. So give me an excuse, Jessica. And then I get this very formal letter. Dear Mr. Alter, we would like you to do the closing plenary keynote speech, which is like a very big deal because everybody's there. And everyone is either really bored because they've been to too many lectures or they're really hyped because they've had a great time. And I think we're going to lean towards the hype end of it. People are excited. People have had a good time. There have been some tremendous lectures. I've been inspired by some. I was so thrilled to meet Bruce Becker in person for who did the hotel in New Haven, Connecticut. And I even have a bit of it in my presentation tonight. So anyhow, after I was invited to speak here, I was kind of panic-stricken because what do you do? And what do you want me to talk about? Well, the topic is renovation, so I've written a lot about that. But then I got invited to speak in Paris at a major conference there set up by the United Nations Environmental Group, and to speak about sufficiency, which is something I've been writing about for a couple of years, about how we have to design things to use less. We in our lives have to use less. Why we should ride a bike instead of drive a car. Why we should build 4 bedrooms instead of 6 bedrooms. All of these things. Just the amount, it all comes down to 3 words: use less stuff. So I said, well, that works into renovation too, because the reason we can renovate buildings is we don't need so many new ones. And so I'm going to be talking more about that. The title in the catalog says I'm talking about fabric first. But I'm talking here to architects, everybody here, and passive house professionals, and they know far more about fabric first than I ever will. I don't know why I said that I was going to talk about that, but I have 3 or 4 slides at the end that I talk about it.
Great.
There's this guy, Nigel Banks, in the UK, who wrote a paper called Fabric Fifth, where he says, first you do heat pumps, and then you do a smart thermostat, and then you do solar panels on the roofs, and then maybe you worry about the fabric. And so I just said, well, I can certainly have some sport with that. And so I'm going to talk about that, but that's about all the fabric talk I'm going to be doing.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I have to say, I feel like it'll be one of the high points for a lot of people. No pressure.
No pressure, but I've done a lot of these, and I've gotten down to a sort of science where I have tons of slides that go bang, 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 and I leave people dazed. And if they're not dazed at the end of it, then I think maybe I haven't done as good a job. But like I said, I think I'm getting good at it.
That's great. That's great. So I know that you're working on a book.
Yes.
And that's coming out soon. I'm also excited about that.
Yes, it's coming out May 21st in North America and a little bit later in Europe because of weird publishing things. And it's called The Story of Upfront Carbon. The reason it's called that is that most people in the industry use the term embodied carbon. And embodied carbon is a stupid name because it's not embodied, it's in the atmosphere. It's left over from when we used to talk about embodied energy, which made some sense, the energy that goes into making something, but it makes no sense for carbon. And 5 years and 1 week ago, I was in a Twitter chat with L. Ron Burrell in New Zealand and another architect in Australia, George Chapas. And L. Ron was saying, well, we've got to have a better name. We should call it vomited carbon or burped carbon or spiked carbon. And we were all thinking, well, that's going to be a hard sell. And then George
But
said,
fun.
Upfront. And I said, upfront carbon emissions works. What I didn't know is that George was also co-editor of a upcoming book from the World Green Building Council in the UK, which he called Bringing Embodied Carbon Upfront, and then listed that first few sections before a building's handover in that as upfront carbon with a little asterisk explaining what it was. And that was like the first official use of the term that's now actually accepted in much of the world. And I think,
cool.
my epitaph may be Lloyd Alter, there at the start of the phrase upfront carbon.
I love that.
And
no surprise, by the way, because because you talk about it.
Yes. The problem with the book has got me terrified is that architects keep saying, I can't wait to read the book. I can't wait to read the book. I said, it's not written for you. You guys know all the technical stuff of X times so many kilograms, times so many factor, times so many miles. I don't want to talk about that. This is a book for your clients. It's a book so they understand why it's important. I use my example of my watch. My Apple Watch has 35 kilograms of upfront carbon. And just imagine if everything weighed as much. You wouldn't be able to lift your wrist. You wouldn't be able to lift anything because of the vast amounts of upfront carbon emitted making all this stuff. And so I do talk about building materials, in particular aluminum and a bit of wood, but I talk about puffer jackets and hamburgers and I forget what else. Oh yes, and e-bikes and all these things so that people understand the implications of embodied carbon are everywhere. And that's what I think will help. I think that the problem is that architects, when they're talking about it, they're in a bubble. The public does not understand. The public does not care. The public is totally confused. One of the things I talk in the book, and I'm doing in my show tonight, is like a Valcuccini kitchen. They're the most beautiful kitchens in the world, made of aluminum and glass. And like they're solid, congealed, embodied carbon. I mean, they're just the worst materials of all. And they ran an ad of a Valcuccini kitchen in the vertical garden, Stefano Borri's vertical apartment that everybody covered in trees and everyone thinks is so green, green, green. And I just go and, look at what this building's made of. Those planters are in these giant concrete planters on huge cantilevers. There's so much concrete in this building that it's insane that anyone considers it green. And this kitchen's made of glass and aluminum. And Valcuccini was really upset. And they said, you're wrong about this. This kitchen will last 100 years. And I said, guys, we've got like 6. We can't think that way anymore.
Well, talk about that a little bit. What do you mean we have 6? Talk to me.
Well, if you say we've got to cut our emissions in half by 2030,
that's what I want to get at.
Which I don't really think is right and the right approach to talk about it. You want me to explain that?
I do, yeah. We're on the podcast. Why not? Yeah.
It all goes back to the IPCC report that said to keep under 1.5, 1.7, or 2 degrees warming, we have these carbon budgets, 500 kilograms for a 50% chance of staying under 1.5 degrees. And they extrapolated from that, saying, okay, we have to cut our carbon emissions by such and such and such and such by half at 2030 to 0 by 2050 to stay under 500 gigatons. But that gave everybody kind of excuse. We have to maybe start worrying about 2030 when in fact what they were giving was a carbon budget, 500 gigatons. And every ton, every kilogram, every ounce of carbon that we add to the atmosphere now is going against that ceiling.
It's basically getting weighed against it.
Yes, so why are we telling people, you have to be by half by 2030? We have to stop emitting carbon now because every bit we do matters. And when you phrase it that way, when you think about the numbers that way, and you forget about 2030 and 2050, which I think are completely irrelevant, then you start having to get a little more serious about what you're doing. That's what I went in, like, why the hamburgers are there? Because every hamburger you buy is like adding another 700 grams of carbon into the air, and the hamburger section's quite funny because the hamburger begat the drive-through, begat people idling in their SUVs, begat the cup holders and the takeout industry, and everything just grew. And so I try to get people to look at things differently. And as I say, when you look at the world through the lens of upfront carbon, everything changes.
Yeah.
That you just don't look at things the same way.
So, one of the things, and if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind getting even further into it, because I love the way you're kind of describing it. But like as an architect, I'm gonna enter a project, and I think a lot of architects will be like, okay, well, so what do I do? And I think what you're describing is you're entering a project. Think about everything you're taking out first. Do you even have to take it out?
Right.
Think about what you're putting in. But let's in the perfect world, which I know we're not in, but in a perfect world, let's talk about an approach to starting a project, which I think is super helpful for those who are maybe listening and probably have their own opinions.
Well, the very first thing, and I have this table in my chart that came out of the World Green Building Council, is the very first thing you do is look at it and say, do we have to do anything at all? Maybe we should do nothing. And when I was a practicing architect a very long time ago, I would go into these gorgeous houses, gorgeous old houses, and the people would say, oh, I want this modern, I want this. And I said, you've just come to the wrong architect. This is a wonderful house, great craftsmanship. Why would you take this stuff out? And I think there's a lot of that. We have to ask, do we need this? And then we have to think about time and the time value of the work that we do. So many people, particularly in America, North America, will say, oh, I'm having a third kid. I've got to have a fourth bedroom. I've got to do all this stuff. But you can live in a house for a long time, and the kids are come and gone in like 18 years. If you go to Paris or Milan, where people may own a little apartment in a nice area and a beautiful part of town, they'll go out and spend thousands on that sort of resource furniture, the original Italian that it came from, and convert a bedroom with $20,000 worth of furniture so that it can accommodate two kids, rather than give up their apartment in the Marais or in some fabulous part of town. And we don't think that way in North America. We just think, oh, this doesn't work for us, let's go get a new one.
So I think, just taking it into kind of my own practice and thinking about the way I could or should and sometimes do work, it would be like starting your scheme A is nothing. Your scheme B or A2 is nothing, but with enough to kind of still satisfy you. Maybe in fact the kitchen really does need to be updated, but better not to rip it all out.
No, and updating is important, and particularly with mechanical systems and things like that. And this whole conference is about retrofit, about doing deep retrofits to eliminate consumption of fossil fuels and reducing energy consumption. A lot of people say, oh, now that we have heat pumps and electricity is getting cleaner, then maybe we don't have to do any deep retrofits anymore. Just throw a heat pump and, insulate the easy spots and caulk it. And it's not true, as Skylar Swinford and Zach Semke showed in Passive House Accelerator. There's no such thing as clean electrons. And we've got to reduce our consumption or we're all going to freeze in January.
You got to build the better box.
Yes, absolutely.
Great.
But then again, it comes the question of sufficiency. How much floor area do we need? How much stuff do we need? One thing I talk about in this is that, like, everybody talks about we've got to reduce our carbon emissions per capita. When you look at all of the IPCC reports and everything, it's all per capita, per capita, per capita. And then what do we do in Passive House and every other standard that we do? We say it's per square meter. So you could have a wealthy guy come along and say, I want to build a 4,000 square foot passive house, and it's passive house because it's so much energy per square meter. But when you total it all up, it's a lot of energy on a per capita basis, especially if you start including the upfront carbon that comes from making the thing, it gets huge.
I hear you.
And it would be really interesting to see if the standard worked on a category of per bedroom or per person. It would look very, very different. But of course, everybody would game the system then. It's very hard.
No matter what we all do, people
game the system.
I think sometimes just because they enjoy it. All right, so we're about to end this, but any kind of parting comments before we end the podcast? And by the way, it's been great having you on. And I'm so happy that I was the one interviewing.
Right.
So thank you.
Well, again, I mean, this engineer in the UK, Will Arnold, who's with the Institution of Structural Engineers. And I don't usually think a structural engineer is going to be forward thinking like this to the degree that he says, we've got to have responsibly dimensioned grids that use less material. We've got to have simpler forms. We've got to get rid of cantilevers and all of this stuff that architects do. And he basically took off all those criteria of, that I said at the beginning of build nothing, build less, build clever, build efficient, all those. He just puts them all into 3 words: use less stuff. And I think that's the mantra that we have to look at everything through. That's the lens of upfront carbon.
Thank you. Appreciate it.